many times per day, I would choose the book over choosing my partner, and that started adding up. It also kept going on much longer than I thought it would. I kept saying, oh, it'll be over after I send in my revisions. Then it was like, oh, they sent back the copy edits. I have to fix them. It'll be over after that. And then it was the marketing phase. That was also hard because I'm a marketer by trade. And so I wanted to make sure I did that right. I also creative directed the cover, which was a huge project. It's really hard when you care about something so much.
Yes.
I'm glad that this is over so I can just write a novel that I feel met about next.
This is Only the Bold, where I have deep, riveting, and fascinating conversations with truly phenomenal humans. I'm your gay, ADHD-having, and compulsively curious host, Gia Goodrich, and among many things, I can't get enough of hearing people's incredible stories and getting inside the way their brains work. Each week, I have conversations where we dig below the surface and really uncover everything it takes to live a truly bold life. Despite the messages we get from media and popular culture, the boldest, truest version of yourself is exactly what the world needs. Hello, hi, hey, how are you today? I am so excited to be up, be standing, be talking. And this episode was so fun, and I cannot wait for you to hear it because we just talk about so many beautiful, twisty, windy things, from identity to how a book comes into the world and becomes a hugely iconic one in a community in just a matter of months, and how we can rough through our ideas, how we can reimagine who we are and our relationships to people. I mean, it's just like we covered so much that I'm super excited for you to get to listen to. But first, I just wanted to check in because I have been thinking about a few themes that I just want to plant little seeds in your brain that we can all be thinking about this week. And one of them is this idea of honesty, authenticity, and telling the truth. Now, one of the things that I have always struggled with as a neurodivergent, also originally coming from the East Coast and moving to the West Coast, is this idea of honesty, right? Because culturally, on the East Coast, there's more of a value system around being honest, being blunt. And there can definitely be a fault side of that, a negative side of that. Because my fabulous Uncle Roy, whom I love so much, from when we would live in New York as kids, I remember one time as an adult, I hadn't seen him in 5 years, and we had been together at this point for 45 minutes. And I don't remember what the insult was. I probably was being somewhat of a dick, but he just looked at me and he's like, I love you in small motherfucking doses. And I was just like, I'm sorry, 45 minutes in 5 years is too much of a dose for you? Fuck you. I mean, arguably pretty harsh. But the magical thing is that because we were so harsh with each other, it's almost like this energy just bubbles up and dissipates. And then we went back to just loving on each other and being amazing. Now, when it comes to, ultimate communication, do we want to be saying really horrible things to each other? I don't think so. But what I really like about that energy is that whilst saying something like that to somebody in Portland, for example, would be such a traumatic event that they might never speak to you again, there's just a different range of how things hurt or harm you and for how long when you have this permission to just be honest about where you're at and where it's coming from, right? And so I'm grateful that I had that upbringing to really be able to express and feel like I could communicate authentically and trust that my relationships would still be there. But then the Portland side, learning especially as I got to teens and adulthood, was that wasn't really welcomed. Now, to that end, there are lots of other benefits, right? You learn how to be able to say things in a way that can sidestep somebody's ego, to do a compliment sandwich and things like that. And I think there's a lot of added benefit to being able to think about how can I say something in a way that will ultimately be received well. Learning how to do that has been a tremendous skill. However, one of the things that's been tough for me in my life integrating those two is that it seems like I'm always nervous. And I think a lot of us, especially in this call out kind of culture and cancel nation, that it makes you feel choked up, where it's I don't know what I can say, how I can say. and ultimately not really trusting your relationships to speak authentically. This has been something that's been coming up for me a lot, most recently within my friendships, because I have also come to a place understanding more about my brain and really recognizing the freedom of just being authentically who you are and laying it out on the table. Now, as you may know, because I referenced it a few times, I torched a friendship because of it. And I still don't know exactly what happened, but there was just sort of a misalignment there. And okay. And then another, well, I guess a few friendships in the last year. And that can be tough to swallow. And recently I sent a message to somebody whom I love, I consider to be a close friend. And I had just said, about this beautiful post that they had written that was like very meaningful and very close to their heart about their identity. And I had just said, hey, I think this post is so important and so meaningful. I love that you're sharing things like that. And also, I don't know if you realize this, but in this one way that you said this, the inference could be taken as, all you people over there have no idea what this experience is like to XYZ, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember exactly what I said, but I tried to say it the best way possible. But also, like, just for me in my life, what I've realized is that you can't deign to know what other people's experiences are. And just because you're coming to this experience from your vantage point doesn't mean that somebody coming from a very different vantage point couldn't have a very similar experience. And that it's something that we tend to do, I think, particularly when we're coming into new and different aspects of our identity. And just in terms of like experience Olympics, where it's just, you're owning what you've gone through. And the tendency is to feel like, now, not that I'm saying that this is going on with my friend at all, but like in general, and I've definitely fallen into this where I just tend to think like, what I've gone through is so hard and I'm experiencing is this, and you don't know, you couldn't understand. Of course, the downside to that is not only do I not know what other people have been going through and living through, but in having had so many conversations with a lot of different humans, both with this podcast, but always throughout my life, I was just like that person who would like sit down with a random 96-year-old and just pick their brain about everything having to do with life. You realize that there are these patterns that whilst an experience might look this way in this generation, it might have looked a different way, but been very similar, very resonant a generation ago, or in a different part of the world. And, I had just floated this out, and I still don't know what the reception was, but I questioned whether or not it was taken well, because it could be taken as a slight or a critique or an insult. When I was thinking about this, what really was tough for me is not that I spoke my truth, because I really have gotten to a place where it's like, I just have to let the chips fall where they may. I have to honor my gut. And this is a part of boldness, right? I have to honor my gut. I have to pay attention to the actions it's taking me toward, and just really let the whatever happens, let that land where it land. And if that means that friendships will be strengthened, abso-fucking-lutely, yes, I love it, yeehaw, let's go. And if it means that some friendships will fall away because that's not feeling resonant with other people, that has to be okay too. Although it's really fucking hard. It's really hard because I found myself second guessing and thinking, is there a way I could have said that differently? Or, I don't want them to feel this way. And what I've learned is that anytime we're trying to really manage, anticipate, manipulate the situation, the outcome, especially when it comes to other people's feelings, we're leaning further away from our boldness and from our authenticity. And so I've just had to, and especially coming out of this year where it's like, oh, I've been burned a few times by being authentic. I also can stack that with like, I have cultivated some really rad, amazing friendships that are being built on authenticity and really valuing that so much. So I wanted to share that because I feel like there are so many moments, especially going into the new year, but really whenever you're listening to this, that we come across these forks in the road where it's like, are you going to be yourself? Or are you going to be a diluted version that you think will really resonate best in the situation? And I don't think it's ever a static point that you arrive at. It's a constant invitation, choose your own adventure sort of path that we're all navigating. It's fun, it's wild, it's interesting, it's great, and it's also terrifying and scary and all of these things. If you're in a situation where you are being confronted with those decisions a lot, I think it's a really good sign because it means that your internal guidance system, your gut, wherever you feel it, whether it's an inner voice or an inner feeling, that you're paying attention to it. And I set a rule for myself quite a few years ago before I was aware of any self development, all that kind of stuff, that just whenever I hear myself arguing with myself, I do the thing that I don't want to do. The more that I've lived with that rule, the more I've learned that that is the thing that saves me, right? It's the difference between inner knowing and all the fear voices that come in. And next week, actually, we're going to have somebody on who's going to talk even more about that. It's going to be great and amazing. You're going to love it. But this week's episode is a banger. I just want to thank you so much for listening. I'm so excited for you to hear this episode, and let's roll into it. Today's guest is a writer, creative director, digital content creator, and flaming bisexual. They've been featured in places like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, CNN, and a bazillion more for their work, which brilliantly interweaves sex, politics, identity, and technology. I just finished the earthquaking memoir, Greedy, Notes from a Bisexual Who Wants Too Much, which was published by Artria, a division of Simon & Schuster, who I'm sure you've heard of. And in it, their essays give us a window into the patchwork of meaningful, cringeworthy, confusing, and delightfully banal moments it takes to grow into queerness, and specifically bisexuality. In the 3 months since the book came out, it's become an instantly bi-conic fixture in the community and hailed as being relatable, laugh out loud funny, and refreshingly illuminating. They also have the bi-monthly newsletter on bisexuality, cultural commentary, and other wonderfully written musings, as well as a huge social following under Generous. The fabulous truth teller and gloriously bold soul, Jen Winston. Woo!
Woo! That was so sweet. Thank you. That was amazing.
Yes, of course.
I feel like I have to high five people as I walk on stage to my desk to talk to you.
Well, I used to have air horns, DJ air horns programmed in, and I just reset it. But like that to me is the vibes after reading your intro. Is the
Okay, great.
Let's just jump right in because I'm really curious for you. You just came out of like this endeavor. It's out in the world. It's already gotten such huge reactions. What does that feel like to know that you've put something out into the world that's so much of who you are and is also resonating in such a positive way?
Well, I mean, thank you so much for reading it. First of all, I'm still like in shock that people are reading it. I can't like look at it again. Like I have it all over my house, but I can't open it because I just will find a word I wish I had changed or something. You know, I'll find something wrong with it. I still can't believe that it's just like available. Like seeing it in bookstores is like truly surreal. Whenever I'm lucky enough to like leave the house and go to a bookstore these days. But yeah, it's funny when you said you just came out. I was like, yeah, I did, you know, in 2019. That's like when I came out as bi, but you meant out of the book publishing process, which is also true. I wrote this book on a really, really quick timeline. I've always wanted to write a collection of personal essays, I should say. I've been wanting to do this since high school. I don't know why. It always was the type of writing I loved to do the most, were like personal essays that were sort of reflective on my life and drawing themes from my life. But I got a few of them published on websites and media publications a while ago. I felt like I had to edit them to be clickbaity. There's a chapter in the book about having threesomes, and parts of that were previously published on Marie Claire. And I had like made it very clickbaity in the version that was published for them. I always knew I wanted to write a book because that was where I felt like my personal essays could live their truth. Before this, I had written like 5 book proposals. I was very invested in this process. A lot of the essays in this book I had started several years ago. It was kind of a collection of everything that I've been working on for years and also a bunch of new stuff and weaving it together. I mean, the whole thing is entirely new because I rewrote it several times.
One of the things that was really surprising to me about the book is the structure of it. When I think about a typical memoir, there's, even in the writing style, the container is consistent all the way through. And one of the surprises that was like so delightful is that you played with structure so much. One of them is what seems like an email correspondence between you and one of your former partners and current friends. And then one of them, it was like a checklist to discern whether or not your friendship is a platonic girl friendship or a crush-based one, which I feel like any queer baby has gone through that process where you're like, oh, I don't know. So how did you land on that? Even that seems like it's a little bit rebellious in taking us through things.
Ooh, I like that. Thank you. I love being described as rebellious. I did that, frankly, because I have ADHD. I need text to keep me moving through it. And I also wanted to kind of play with form. I only wanted to do it if it made sense for the text. So that essay that you brought up, it's called Girl Crush Clinical Observations. And it's written as like a medical assessment. And the reason I wrote it that way is because it often can be hard to like diagnose these crushes. Like I kept honing in on that word diagnose. It's hard to look at relationships you have and be like, is this platonic or is this romantic? Especially hard as a bi person. Not that lesbian or gay or other monosexual people don't have those challenges. But as a bi person, it's even harder because you can write it, you can use your attraction that would typically be seen as straight attraction to kind of write the whole thing off. And so I wanted to explore that challenge and like the role that straightness has in us writing our own queerness off. I don't know how you identify.
I identify as gay, and I came out as like a lesbian in 2008-ish or something like that. Before that, I had been with men. Now, granted, like cis men, let's say, they were always very effeminate, often confused for gay guys. And so when I did come out, what I would say is that everybody likes their mix of oil and vinegar that they dip bread in. Well over 10 years ago, we had different language, right? So there wasn't the nuance that we have now in terms of gender identity and everything. So what I would say, if it's in a male body, they're more effeminate seeming. And then if it's in a woman's body, they're more masculine seeming. That was a way that I kind of explained it. The umbrella term of gay for me has space in it that is inherently bisexual. Because most of the lesbians I came out with give us 10 years and we've all had interactions with people of different genders. Not all of us, but a lot of us. It's curious how things keep shifting and how the way we think about ourselves can shift over time too.
Whatever word you use is awesome. For me, the word bisexuality has come to mean fluidity, and it has come to mean acceptance of myself in all my versions and all my forms. And so whatever that word can be for you, great. Whatever word you can use that kind of taps into that idea of like you can contain multitudes and you are allowed to not see the world in binaries. That's really what bisexuality does for me. And so if the word gay does that for you, that's awesome. I don't think that people should try to take that away from you, least of all me. And so part of the reason I wanted to write about bisexuality is because there's so many stigmas wrapped up in that term that influence other words like gay, and they influence the way that we see ourselves within our relative identities, even if we don't identify as bisexual openly.
Yeah, I would love to get into some of those because I'm really grateful for the book because as somebody who's identifies now as gay, maybe lesbian, but with a more like open space, it's interesting in thinking about the ways that biphobia has been so embedded that it's really wonderful to have this exposure. And I feel like growth just constantly happens whenever you're continuing your exposure to things. And so your book is really this wonderful way, I think, for myself and others to really expand that idea of what it means. Because as you know, and you talk about in your book, it's like bisexuality has always gotten the short end of the stick in any of the core groups. But what's happened even in the time frame since I've come out is that those groups aren't as solid as even we thought they were. And why should they be when people are having a more nuanced understanding of their own gender and how that's expressed and their own sexuality, that it would stand to reason that those arbitrary delineations are becoming more porous.
Mm-hmm. That's like the goal for me. Biphobia has kind of come from this place of gatekeeping, of queer community needs to protect itself, like don't let these traitors in from that side. There's also another side to biphobia, which comes from being a bi person who's like come out as a lesbian or a gay person, and you're within the community. And then you're like, I actually don't reject all of these things that I like once said I rejected, as like you're learning. Also, as like gender opens those doors and allows us all to become more fluid with our understanding of gender. That's kind of why I honed in on bisexuality, because for me, it encompasses everything that I've had to unlearn about the world. It's my sexuality, but it's also a lens for me to really look at ideas of gender, which I definitely once saw as very binary and saw myself as a woman. And I was like, here's how I compare to the ways think that women should be. And I write about this in the end of the book, but I always struggled because I hated cooking. I still hate cooking, but I'm trying. My resolution is to get into it, but I think I hate it because I have ADHD, but that's another story. I always thought that made me like a bad woman. I think I always like envisioned myself getting into relationships with men and then them leaving me because I couldn't like feed them, which is so ridiculous. And so I had built so much shame around this part of the gender role of being a woman that I didn't live up to. And I really just felt like I was a disappointment. And so a large arc in the book is kind of understanding what womanhood, how it impacted my sense of self and what it meant to finally shed that. Because a lot of bisexuality involves shedding the idea of gender roles dictating our lives. I mean, a lot of queerness in general, you have to do that. And queer relationships force you to live outside of gender roles dictating everything for you. There's that New York Times piece that's like, what all straight people can learn from queer relationships. And it's mainly about not letting gender roles dictate things and communicating. That was all not stuff I had practiced until I unlearned my stigmas around bisexuality, that it didn't exist, that bisexuals were greedy, hence the title,
Yeah.
that bisexuals were confused. Even right when I came out, I still had a lot of those stigmas and I still carried a lot of that pressure. But the thing that really helped me understand it was actually reading bi critical theory, which I did not know existed until I came out. And particularly this book called Bi Notes for a Bisexual Revolution by Sherry Eisner. Sherry talks a lot about how in the bi community, like most of the articles you'll see about bi people are like, bi people are not greedy, bi people are not confused, bisexuals are valid. But Sherry's work talks about how in order to really take a stand for bi politics, we have to not refute those claims, because some of us are greedy in the way people are putting it forth. Some of us have a lot of sex, which is the subtext of calling someone greedy, is that promiscuity is bad, which that's only bad if like monogamy is the default and if having a lot of sex as a femme presenting person is a bad thing. Sherry's work really helped me flip those stereotypes. And I think the most interesting one was actually confusion. If confused was a better title, I might have named the book Confused.
Yeah.
I loved Sherry's reframing of confusion. Sherry reframes it as bisexual confusion can be seen as a destabilizing agent of social change. Reading that sentence was the first time I ever felt proud to be bi. I was like, oh my God, this sexuality that I felt like was fake, that I never heard the word used on TV, that I thought was just something I'd made up in my head or me trying to get queer clout. That's what I thought it was for such a long time. It's real, and my confusion is actually the best part because it means that I don't have to choose, and I recognize that you can sit with multiple truths at once. And I really think a lot of things in my life crystallized for me once I realized that. That's like a standard learning that everyone can have, regardless of your sexuality, is that we don't have to heed these binary ideas. Bisexuality was really a powerful thought tool for me in that process. And what I've learned is that a lot of bi people have to go through a similar process of unlearning, where we're kind of predisposed to unlearning binaries before we can accept our own sexuality. I've learned that that's a pretty common experience.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense to me. And I think one of the things, they've heard on this podcast, you fabulous bold souls, is that one of the themes that comes up a lot is the idea of mixedness. There are different ways that we've talked about it racially, in terms of gender identity, in terms of sexuality. It's just this idea of being in between, yes, and not taking things at face value when you're posed with these false dichotomies. One of the things that I love so much and I resonate with so deeply across all these different areas is seeing that as a commonality. You can experience this type of resonance with people who have very different identities than you do if you have this shared okayness in being in an in-between space. One of the things that I've talked about a lot is that if you were fortunate, like me, which of course at the time I didn't, think it was very fortunate, to be racially mixed, to grow up between the East Coast and West Coast, to grow up between Catholicism and Buddhism, that at the time I was just like, fuck, I'm fucked up. Like, this sucks. I couldn't help but create a way to reconcile things for myself and therefore get really comfortable with that. When it comes to people who, through their own identity, through their own journeys, haven't had to find that in between space, how is it that you've seen people can start to understand what that could feel like? Because if you don't understand it, a lot of times it comes out as feeling threatened. And I think when we talk about the history of bisexuality, there isn't really any other way to describe it, right? Like that it threatens heteronormative ideals. It threatens people's perception of being homosexual because then, the historical thing has been, well, then it's a slippery slope. People don't take us seriously. They think it's just a phase, like all of this kind of stuff that, in terms of gay rights, people have been working on for a long time. So I'm curious for you, like whether it's in people in your own life, through research, how you've seen people be able to come to terms with and find that in between space.
This is a personal story about myself and my partner and my mom that I haven't told anyone. I normally don't tell things that are about my partner like this, but it's also really about me. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it's about me. So I'm comfortable to tell it. Well, when you were saying like people not seeing binaries, the first thing I thought of was people misgendering my partner, which happens a lot. They use they, them pronouns exclusively. And I can always kind of tell when someone genders them like a certain way based on their appearance or based on like any external clue that they got, some way that they're reading their name or some way that they're reading a medical chart or something. I can always just tell that they haven't done that work. Even though it's like a split second decision, it happens to all of us because all of us have more work to do on that than we don't have to do, including like my partner, including all of us, like including non-binary people. Everyone has work to do continuing to unlearn the binaries we subscribe to. When my partner and I were home at my house for Thanksgiving, which my parents and my partner have a great relationship, and my parents have worked really hard to use they, them pronouns correctly. They're even using them for me sometimes, and I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. So that's been really nice. Like, they're awesome. And my mom just kept misgendering my partner. At one point, my mom turned to my partner, and my partner later told me this. And my mom said, "It's not that I think of you as a woman, it's that I think of Jennifer, me, as a lesbian." And I was like, wait, what? Like, what logic are you doing there, Mom? I literally just wrote a book on bisexuality, first of all. It makes me very confused because for a long time I thought that hearing people use they, them pronouns indicated that they had this understanding of other possibilities, other options. When my mom said that, I was like, oh, she actually hasn't done any of the work to understand that. She's working on the language, which is good. It's better than nothing. The language has so informed my thought. Understanding that bisexuality could exist as a third option. Of course, there are infinite options, but, as an alternative to these things I saw as a binary of heterosexual and homosexual, that was like, the word bisexual was so important for like crystallizing that understanding. To see my mom not have the same kind of awakening when using they, them pronouns was really confusing. Not in a fun bisexual way, but like confusing to me in a legitimate way. I was like, whoa, like not everyone has that type of connection with language. So, I mean, that's just sort of the first example that I thought of because she knows that I identify as bisexual. She knows I don't see bisexuality as binary, but I see it as encompassing the capacity to be attracted to all genders. She hasn't read my book, but she knows I wrote the book. She hasn't read it because I asked her not to read it.
Oh, okay.
The dedication is to my parents who promised they wouldn't read it. They're honoring that. Then to hear her think of me as a lesbian is so strange. That's what the brain is doing. And it just helped me like look at someone very well-intentioned on kind of a growth journey who hadn't done that foundational work of unlearning binaries. And it shows, like, your binary perception of the world is showing, Mom. I mean, I love my mom. of course. I really do value her work around this, but that was just like one of the weirdest pieces of logic I've ever heard anyone say.
But it does actually make sense if the default like gravitational force is binaries for a lot of people, that in order to take you out of hetero, she would have to temporarily place you in lesbian in order to then say, oh, okay, there's an in-between.
Maybe I caught her in an in-between moment of like showing her work on the algebra test,
Right.
like I caught her between the math problem. And my partner also did, and they caught the brunt of it. It becomes so apparent when it's like, oh, we don't have the same perception of the world. Okay. And maybe you'll get there. I get why people do that because it does take steps. There's this episode of Radiolab that I always re-listen to about color. I don't know if you've heard it. It's fascinating. It's about how colors came to be. There was this one thing they talk about in it, how when Homer wrote the Odyssey, there are like no mentions of the color blue, and they aren't sure that humans could see the color blue yet. Homer described the ocean as like a wine color or something. They think because we didn't have the language for the color blue, we couldn't see that color in existence. Like those things were so entwined. And so I understand if your brain cannot grasp the idea of a space between existing, like you don't know what to do. And so we see these like strange logic hoops.
Yeah. Well, and I think about something similar is I have, and I'll be obtuse for the sake of privacy, but I have some people in my life. One of them identifies as trans non-binary, and their grandparent figure, like an author, very intellectual, very set in their ways, affirms the name, but cannot affirm the pronoun because of it not being grammatically correct. Even though articles have been sent, right? It's like, it's a fact that language changes over time. It's also a fact that like, it's now grammatically correct. And to me, what's so fascinating looking at things like that as a case study is that it's almost like they're choosing dissonance over an in-between space. And you would think that from like a mental vantage point, the dissonance would be more difficult, right?
That's exactly it.
What I really work on is like cultivating the empathy, really try to acknowledge that everybody is where they're at because of a lifetime of whatever they've had to deal with. Even though, there are moments that like I just start bubbling up and seething inside because I'm like, you need to let go of this. You are now wrong. You are now standing on the wrong side of history. Let it go. But I also think how sad it would feel to hold on to something so tight, even if I knew it was hurting people around me. And I think to a certain extent, we all do that on some level, or whether it's like a self-concept or a belief about ourselves or somebody else. In a weird way, it almost operates as a mirror, I think, to myself, where it's like, whoa, I really want to look for those spots in my own being.
Yeah, you're hitting on so many things that my partner and I have been talking about just because we're like knee deep in self-help books right now, just like trying to be respectful of each other during quarantine. For some reason, neither of us have read The Four Agreements. It seems every time I mention that book, everyone's like, yeah, read it in like grade school. And I'm like, okay, I had never heard of it. But we're on the second agreement right now, which is don't take anything personally. Everyone's behavior is a reflection of their own life. Fortunately, someone had told me that idea a long time ago. But when they told it to me, they said it as if it was the most basic thing to know in the world. I was like, And then I like turned the corner and widened my eyes. And I was like, oh my God, this is life-changing knowledge. Like what? Everyone's actions aren't about me. I think that's been such an important part of accepting myself and my bisexuality as well as, oh, actually, it's okay if people don't want to date bisexuals. Bisexuals don't want to date them. That took me a long time to understand. I think now I identify as like bi for bi. I realize I'm most attracted to other bi people. The essay you described with the emails was me to my friend Ben, who's still a very good friend, like came over and had dinner the other day with my partner and I, is also bisexual. And it took me forever to realize that that was a queer relationship because it presented as a straight relationship because he is a guy and I'm a woman. That's been something I've been reflecting on a lot. That was actually a large part of our dynamic. We wanted to explore our sexuality while we were in that relationship. Ultimately, that relationship was sort of a joke, as the book kind of calls. I mean, it was like intense at the time.
I mean, like so many relationships, upon past examining, you're like, what the fuck
Yeah.
were we trying to do here?
I'll tell you, the weirdest essay to write was the one about the men who ghost me. That's what it's called. The men who ghost me. For that essay, I wanted to bring out some like different specifics from these. I go through a bunch of different conversations with a bunch of different men who ghosted me. I went back through old texts and emails, pulled out specifics of things we were talking about. And I was like, oh my God, they were so leading me on. This is absurd. I was like, this person was in love with me. What's going on? Why did they just literally disappear? That's what the essay is about. But that was a fun one to rewrite because I got to go back and see how absurd those relationships were.
What's fascinating to me is like a human who is deeply neurodivergent. My working memory is like zero. Thinking about writing a memoir just feels like I don't even know how to begin to claim that any of it was real because my memory is just like so non-existent. In your work, it's not only your rememberings, but there's also all sorts of critical theory. There's all of this stuff that's also baked into it. And so I'm curious, like, what was your process for researching for everything that went into it?
Also, as someone with ADHD, you may relate when I say I had no process. I just was like, please let me finish this by the deadline.
Right.
I don't know. I'll write a word in this chapter and then a word in the last chapter. It was a mess. But throughout quarantine, I've been working with an ADHD coach who is
Ooh.
incredible. I highly recommend her website, work. I think she's booked on coaching clients, but I just recommend all the resources she creates. Her name is Marla Cummins, and she's awesome. At the point when I got the book deal, she basically became my productivity coach. In the last 2 weeks, I had to submit the manuscript. She kind of helped me map out what I had left to do and like put post-its on the wall. She's awesome. And the one thing that she's really helped me do is restructure all my goals and priorities around values. So it's not just like, I have to do this thing today. It's like, I actually want to do this thing because it aligns with my values. And so I'm not going to spend this whole morning playing solitaire on my phone. I'm just not going to do it. Like I'm not going to give in to my ADHD. And I think with the book, it was such a core value of mine to finish it and to make it good. That was just self-motivating. I probably did more writing and more reading in those 3 months than I've ever done in my life. I was like reading at lightning speed, rereading. I like definitely have way too many books. And I'm so happy I had them because I was like, oh yeah, it's in that book, that quote I want. And I could like pull them out. I really felt like a lifetime of learning was kind of put to use. And I wrote it, I should have said this earlier, I wrote it so quickly because we wanted to get it out by Visibility Day. I got the book deal in October of 2020, and we wanted to get it out by September, by Visibility Day 2021, which is an absurd timeline.
For somebody who's not familiar with books, that's not the whole time you have to write it, right? So in that timeline to get it out, how was it broken out?
I got the book deal October 15th because it was the day after my birthday. Then my first draft was due January 18th. So when you submit a proposal, you put an estimate for how long it'll take you. And I had written 6 months to deliver a first draft. So we cut that down to 3 months, basically. But a proposal is also like a 90-page document, 80 to 90-page document that maps out your entire book, like structurally, an overview of what you want to accomplish, who the target audience is. That was a big reason that my book sold to a publisher, is because it had a target audience built in of bi people. Really, there's not a lot that exists for us in the world. That was exciting. But then you also have to share comparative titles. So like other titles that prove that there's a market for your book, and there like wasn't any comparative title for my book. So I pulled a few other like queer books that were relevant, but queer and like queer humor books. Then you also have to have like a write-up of every chapter and 2 sample chapters at the end. you send to agents, and then agents send that to publishers. My publisher, we met and they were like, see, it says 6 months, but do you think you can do it in 3? So yeah, so I spent the first 3 months writing the first draft. Then I did like one round of revisions. And then next time they were sending it back to me, it was copy edited, basically. Sometimes you might have more rounds back and forth than that, but that was all I had. When they sent it back to me at the copy editing phase, I was like, this is awful. This is a bad book. And so I went 2 weeks past my deadline to submit my changes of their copy edits. And I rewrote the whole thing at that point, which is very frowned upon.
Wow.
But I'm really glad I did it. I share that story because a lot of friends and people in my life were like, this is your book. Do whatever it takes to make it as good as you want it to be. And so I did that.
One of the things that I love in talking to people is that when you're outside of the process, you can create all these imaginings of what it was like, right? And so being able to talk to somebody who's gone through it, and I love that you share that because to a certain extent, we all feel like fuck ups and imposters. That doesn't really change no matter what you really do. One of the things that I love in talking to people is that, you know, when you're outside of the process, you can create all these imaginings of what it was like, right? And so being able to talk to somebody who's gone through it, and I love that you share that because I feel like to a certain extent, we all feel like fuck ups and imposters. That doesn't really change no matter what you really do. So figuring out what that process looks like. Did you work with someone on that? Did you have guidance or how did you firm that up? So it was really good.
As I mentioned, I had written like 5 different proposals in the past, and most of them were personal essays about like sex stories. Most of them ended with me being like, oh, I'm bi. Like, I don't have to deal with this for men anymore. Like, that was mainly the end point. It was always like a different way to get to that. These proposals were bad. But each of them, I had like mapped out 5 different memoirs prior to this. And I had taken like a class at Gotham Writers Workshop, and I took one at the New School about how to write a proposal. So I had a good idea and good understanding of what they looked like. During the pandemic, I got productivity anxiety, I guess, as like everybody kind of got. And I was like, I have to do something with this time. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to just get really serious about my book again. I haven't gotten serious about it in a while. I took some time to kind of just live in the world, and I had an idea. And I was like, I think I really want to write it about bisexuality. I'd only been I had learned all this new stuff, and I was like, this is it. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'd been out for a year and a few months. And I was like, bisexuality is my way to talk about all the things I want to talk about. I had also written one book proposal about social justice in general and unlearning a lot of things about my own privilege that I had not, like that process of unlearning my privilege. And then by the time I finished the book proposal, I was like, oh, I don't need to write this. Someone else should write this book from not the privilege perspective. It doesn't need to exist. I'm glad I got that out of my system. But when I kind of came up with this idea of bisexuality as a lens, I was like, I can apply all these social justice, I can bring in that information that's very important to me to like write about, but it's not my central hook because then it's part of my story and it enriches my story and also directs people to others' stories without it being the whole story. So that was a helpful breakthrough. But then for this particular book, I had an agent and she wasn't really helping me very much. She was my second agent. I'd been through multiple agents. And I was like, I just got to kind of start fresh. I also fired a manager at that time.
Wow.
Well, because my manager didn't think that greedy was a good idea, didn't think that there was a market or an audience. And I was like, I don't want to work with you.
Yeah, it seems like belief is kind of a big part of the social contract and like actual contract of being a manager.
Especially around bisexuality. I think there was a lot of biphobia in the dismissal. And I was like, oh, wow, you just like also don't see the business case for this. So I'm just going to see myself out. And I'm really happy I did that. It was obvious the minute I sent that email that my management team was relieved as well. It wasn't a great fit. So then I was looking for another manager and I messaged like a networking group. I said, I'm looking for a manager to help me bring a book into the world. And someone recommended someone named Rochelle Fredson, who is a proposal coach who had worked at publishers and helped in the marketing department. So really brought a lot of book marketing savvy to my proposal to help me flesh out the audience of the bisexual community, because it can be a hard community for marketers to crystallize, which is a good thing in the general scheme of like not being sold to, but also it's part of by erasure. And so she really helped me flesh all that out. And then she connected me with my agent, and then my agent sold the book very quickly. And then suddenly I was writing the book. Part of the reason my partner and I are now doing so much like restorative repairing work is because the book was a horrific strain on our relationship. It mattered so much to me. It was never like a you choose this or this, but many times per day I would choose the book over choosing my partner, and that started adding up. Although my partner's very proud of me and very supportive, and I'm so grateful for that. It also kept going on much longer than I thought it would. I kept thinking that, oh, now it's over. I kept saying, oh, it'll be over after I send in my revisions. Then it was like, oh, they sent back the copy edits. I have to fix them. It'll be over after that. And then it was the marketing phase. That was also hard because I'm a marketer by trade. And so I wanted to make sure I did that right. I also creative directed the cover, which was a huge project. A lot went into that. It's really hard when you care about something so much.
Yes.
I'm glad that this is over so I can just write a novel that I feel met about next.
It looks a lot of times really glossy when you've achieved something. And really being able to understand all the moments that you have to go through in order to get there. Most of us people in creative endeavors feel like we're failing most of the time. And it's really difficult when you are your work. I don't really like that as a frame because it can be tough emotionally and psychically when you're like, I'm selling myself and all of that kind of stuff. We are typically so close to what we're doing. And for you, it's literally about you and your life that, yeah, that can be tough. You get the copy edited version back. You're all of a sudden like, this book sucks. What was that version that made you think this actually isn't a good book? And then how did you flip it to something that you ended up being really proud of?
The word glossy is a great word because it really does look glossy, but it is so not. Like, I've been just recovering. Since the day the book came out, October 5th, I've been in recovery from the book. And even then, I had like promotion to do. I think the first time it set in what I had accomplished, truly, I think the first time it set in was over the winter break. And I was like, this time last year, I was up at 6 writing until midnight. That's and for 3 weeks straight. So it felt so nice to just relax this year. And it really helped me understand, oh, wow, you had a hard time. You did something huge. When I sent it to them and then when they sent me the copy edits back, it was in this structure where it opened with a 30-page FAQ about bisexuality. And I had put a lot of research into that. That was one of the most time-consuming things I had worked on. I tried to make it funny because it was factual, but I wanted it to be interesting. That was in the manuscript when I sent it to my publicist. At the time when I sent it to my publicist, I was like, I want this kind of to be seen as a literary memoir because I know that I have this platform, but I am a student of the craft of writing and I care a lot about that. Even though I don't have like an MFA, I almost got one. Like, it's very a part of my personhood to have it be marketed in that way. And for me to be seen as a writer. The publicist was like, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not sure like New York Times coverage is in the cards. That was the one thing I wanted. So I was like, okay. But then I wept a lot. I think she was the first person who was honest with me about that. And I didn't understand why. I really think parts of it are good. And so then I got the copy edited manuscript back and I was like, it's not a literary book. It has this 25-page FAQ in the beginning. So I completely restructured it. I made 18,000 changes at that point. I took out almost every adverb, not every, I'm sure there's hundreds of adverbs still in the book. I did a lot of searches for the words was and is and tried to use stronger verbs. Like I did very technical writing things. I cut 5,000 words or something, which is a lot of words. Because it was going to be 350 pages. And I was like, no one's going to read this at all if it's that long. In fact, the total length now, it's like 299. The page count that it comes up on like Amazon is 320. And I like hate it. I am really happy that I kind of caught that. It didn't get New York Times coverage, but it got a lot of other great coverage. I talked to a lot of reporters who really liked it, cared about it, and wanted to interview me because it felt new and different. And like, these are people I respect in the literary world. And I was floored by the reception.
I think that is such a magic kernel to hold on to, is having the dream, the vision, the goal is one thing, but allowing it to be what it's going to be, really honoring what that thing is, even if it's not necessarily what you set out to do. because your book is refreshing in a way. Have you seen Pen 15?
Oh, yeah.
So that is like literally time period that I grew up in. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's about two best friends who are my age playing themselves in middle school and all the things that come up. And there's just like, it's in the specificity that I think, which is interesting because, you know, like in marketing, there's this weird like trope about generality that you want things to be general so they can apply to everyone. And then really in practice, what you realize is that it's in the specificity that people can have that resonance and really connect with something, even if that specific detail isn't what they experienced. In the show, similarly in your book, there were all these little micro moments of you describing something. And particularly in that one essay where you were talking about the clinical diagnosis, I just, as a young, not out queer person, I remember having a best friend in high school and noticing that everybody else felt great when she would hold their hand. So she would just randomly pick up my hand and hold it and walk down the street. And I would my whole body would go tense because it was something different for me. Even if it wasn't something I was consciously aware of, it was just different for me. And so there were all these moments that I think are just so resonating with people because of you being really honest about who you are and what your truth was.
Well, I'm happy you referenced Pen 15 because I love that show. I think it's so brilliant. And I often think about that era of our lives. I always think about how the show Pen 15 like speaks to a very specific age group who kind of grew up in this exact realm. My brother, who's 4 years younger than me, does not like it. And he's like huge into comedy, but he doesn't like that show because many of the references, he's slightly too young for them. It's really interesting. When it hits, but when it doesn't, it kind of doesn't. And I love the sentiment you outlined about the general and specifics because that's so true. I actually thought about Pen 15 a lot, especially when I was referencing AIM or AIM.
Yes.
I called it AIM. I was like, am I channeling Pen 15 too much? Do they now have the monopoly on talking about this time period? And I was like, you know what? These are my truths, so I'm just going to share them. So I'm glad that landed. I was unsure if I was crossing a line by doing it too much.
Oh no, it made you sink into that state of mind in that time period so effortlessly. Because there are things that I totally forgot about AIM. And really looking back at similarly, like a lot of my early sexualized encounters were with strangers in chat rooms that I, had totally wiped from my memory. So one of the things that I love and also just makes me so uncomfortable and nervous is just talking about sex, period. Your book covers the whole range of sexual encounters. You talk about sexual assault, to relationships that are wonderful, to relationships that didn't work out, and sexual experiences that are like kinky in an awesome way. As somebody who just has not done enough work to uncover, or I guess heal from the sexual awkwardness that I have, I revere, and it also just makes me nervous even thinking about. Just talk to me about the experience of having so much of who you are, your brand, your work revolve around this subject that is very polarizing and awkward for people, even if sometimes we don't want it to be.
I do have a day job. I just actually changed roles at my day job. Like my previous team very much knew that I like promote vibrators on the internet. They don't like think anything of it at this point. I came into the org like in 2017 when the Me Too movement was at full force, and it empowered me to talk openly about sex in the workplace, not in a personal way, but in a way that I'm aware of it and so are you, and like everyone should be able to have it. But now, so I just switched teams like right before this book came out, and it's been very strange. Even telling people that I wrote a book about bisexuality, part of the issue for me with coming out as bi is that bisexuality is so often sexualized because it has the word sex in it. I think there's something literally happening today on the day that we're recording this on the internet where Ted Cruz's daughter came out as bisexual. She's 13, so everyone sort of like respect her privacy. She came out on TikTok, so it's like, is this public? What's going on? But then there's also people being like, how does she know she's bisexual? She's 13. It's because bisexual identity is so sexualized that you associate it with maturity in the same way that other queer identities are also. It's like you can't know that you're gay yet.
Because it terrifies adults to think about young people having sex, even though we know that young people definitely do have sex.
straight people have sex, and it's just the act of declaring yourself as having a different preference to what is seen as the norm means it has to out you as not only being queer in that way, but also as like talking about your sex life. That was why I never wanted to bring up bisexuality in a work context. Why are you bringing this up, Jen? People are going to think it's weird. Nobody cares about your sex life. It's probably an HR violation. So I always felt very strange about it in that environment and around like parents and families. But writing this book has really forced me to talk openly about it. And I think that's also why I love the title Greedy, and why I ultimately went with that title is because it requires us to also kind of unlearn our stigma around sex in order to reclaim that stereotype. Like we have to be like, it's fine to be greedy and to want to have a lot of sex. There's literally nothing wrong with it. It definitely gets awkward. I dedicated the book to my parents and asked them not to read it for a reason, because there are some lines I can't cross.
I just kind of had like a little epiphany as I was listening to you say that, because one of the reasons why identifying as gay has been such a solid place to sit for so long is that gay is experienced in a cultural context more directly than a sexual context in the last however many years. Like when you say gay, you think about the movements, the music, the pride flags, all of that kind of stuff. I hadn't even really thought about this before, but I wonder if the reason that I have really settled on something that is pulled away from sexuality, whilst also like honoring who I am, has been a safety mechanism. Saying like pansexual or bisexual or homosexual are all things that image is brought up in your brain as soon as you say it. And I don't want people to imagine me fucking anybody.
How do you feel about the word lesbian?
Similarly, like has more cultural roots at this point. Saying lesbian is like flannel. I mean, even though I never adhered to them, I was always a invisible lesbian, and then dated people who were like 100-footers so that, I had a beard.
I don't even know that term. What is a 100-footer? Like, I embarrass myself sometimes with how little I know about specifically lesbian culture. It is such a firm culture. And so I never felt like I fit into that culture. So I never felt like I was queer enough.
It's like a huge hole. The vernacular is always changing, all of that kind of stuff. But a 100-footer is just somebody that from 100 feet away, you're pretty sure that they're gay. By the way, they walk, they talk, they move, whatever.
But I'm like learning new things all the time. I still feel like, oh God, the bisexual has a question. Like, I'm so embarrassed to ask, because I really do think the fact that there are lesbian bars and there are gay bars. I write about this in one of the chapters, and I quote the book Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lynn, which is really about the different meanings that gay has taken on. And for me, what that means is that I've seen these cultural spaces and been like, they aren't mine. I am there as a guest, even though I identify as queer. I'd never felt like I was queer enough to take any form of ownership over those spaces. And so I think it's a beautiful thing when people can find welcoming culture within lesbian spaces.
I haven't experienced that in a long time, because when I came out in like 2008, there was like a mob of us. We used to run 20 plus deep. We would have lesbian parties. We had the Egyptian room. Like it was just like you jumped into the culture and it was like there. Fast forward more than 10 years later, a lot of those individuals no longer identify as lesbians for various reasons. Before COVID, what we started noticing is that we would just have more queer parties. From those 20 people who then identified as cis lesbians, at least 8 are now trans or trans non-binary. And then sexually may identify as bi or hetero. It's shifted so much that it's eaten into the amount of people in this space. And I see a lot of people that kind of slide into that thinking, that where it's like, we used to be such a huge group of us, and now our group is getting smaller and smaller. The other way to think about it is that our notions of everything have expanded in a way that's affirming and including more people. I'm always excited to like be in a space where there's more represented in all sorts of ways. It can be tough in terms of how you identify, because again, going back to that idea of like how fixed you are in your identity, if you're only tied to an identity that you perceive to be shrinking, that doesn't feel good. One of the things that this brings up to me, which is something that was like a core thread through your book, is this intentionality in what you're expressing. In researching, I heard that you had a sensitivity reader. So can you talk a little bit about that process? Because it was just really so clear that you were really wanting to make sure that you were presenting things in a way that acknowledged your privilege, presenting things in a way that were as accurate and kind and accounting for these different dynamics that can be really tough to talk about.
You really did do a lot of research because I think I only talked about that like one time. A request from me was that we have a sensitivity reader. I had heard that that was a thing that some books did. And I was like, oh, this is mandatory because the chapter about AIM is called True Life, I Masturbate Wrong. It's also largely about this idea that comes from disability theorist Mia Mingus around embracing the ugly rather than fearing the ugly, which is sort of a step further than people don't necessarily have to be beautiful for you to respect them. It's sort of reclaiming a term that's socially been used to other many different marginalized groups, the idea of ugliness. And I wanted to make sure that I was bringing in that theory and not being ableist in the process. And I needed somebody else to look at that, like someone who has lived experience with a visually detectable disability. So we found sensitivity readers for that. We also found sensitivity readers. There was a chapter about a trip I took to Cuba. That was an old chapter I had written like right after. It was about several trips to Cuba. It was a chapter I had written years ago. The sensitivity reader had so much feedback. I completely changed the chapter. I did so much research on the history of Cuba. And all of it was about reflecting on my own role perpetuating colonial ideas in being a traveler. And then we cut the chapter. So that's not in the book. I'm glad because it wasn't there and it was better to have it not be there at all. There was another chapter about submission politics and who gets to own their trauma in the bedroom. And that chapter was super complicated. And a disability reader found a lot of unchecked racism in the prose. And I was like, I took kind of a pause from writing the book entirely. And I was like, I need to like sit with this chapter. How did I not realize these things? So I had to do a lot of self-reflection on that. That chapter is not in the book for a number of reasons too. So that was a really important process for me as a learning experience, but it was great. I learned so much from each of these readers. They're all thanked in my acknowledgments. Some people have mentioned that observations around racism or privilege are often relegated to the footnotes. I put so much thought into that. I knew that specific comment was coming. So I actually restructured the whole book to make footnotes an integral part of the text so that those footnotes would mean more, because I tried putting them in the text. It didn't work. It felt like it was tacked on. It felt more like I was trying to show off the knowledge than inform readers of this thing that I knew, which a lot of the comments still say it's virtue signaling. I guess I'd rather they say that than me not have said anything. So it was a very fine line. I take issue with that footnote comment specifically because I challenge people to write a memoir about their own sexual history and seamlessly integrate aspects about social justice that they deem worthy of also sharing with their readers. The FAQ I had originally had like so many books that I thought people should read and like why I thought people should read them. And it had all these other questions. It had direct answers to whether bisexuality was a privilege, which is a common thing people say. It's not. Sometimes bi people have privileges. I am a bi person with many privileges, but they're separate to my bisexuality. The restructuring ended up taking out some of that, but it was worth it, I think, for the read of the book. If more people read the book, more people are exposed to the information. That was my goal.
Better you get dinged doing your best, making an active effort, than get dinged for doing too little. Because it's like, no matter what you do, I think somebody's going to have something to say.
That's fine. I feel like that is like a tax that I accept as a class privileged person who wrote a book. Like a lot of comments also say that that's a clear issue of my privilege, which is true. And I tried to acknowledge that in the first prologues, but it's a white cis bi person's memoir. I don't know what people are necessarily expecting. I tried to direct to as many other resources as possible. I think that is part of the challenge of there not being a lot of content out there for bi people. Like people are expecting it to do a lot. I just hope it paves the way for more stories because I do not want to shoulder the burden of having to tell all bi stories, and I want more of them out there so I can feel seen and so I can feel justified in having told one.
I was reading some of your reviews, and one of them sounds very Carrie Bradshaw to me, but it's Greedy is an essay collection that covers a lot of ground, clocking in at over 300 pages, and I found myself asking, is it trying to cover too much?
My answer to that person is yes. I wish I'd advocated for another year to make it the easiest 240-page read, but I'm very proud of what I accomplished in the time I accomplished. The hardest part about reading all those reviews is I'm like, yep, you're right. Fortunately, there's a lot of really good ones, but I'm always just scrolling through those. I did the thing. I saw a post on Girl Boss, I believe. Someone sent it to me like the week before my book came out about screenshotting positive comments and reviews and like keeping them in a folder. I've been doing that. It has proved really helpful in certain times because I get several DMs a day from people who are just so relieved that this book exists. And they're like, it reminded me that I could write a book about my own experience and that it's important enough to write a book about. I didn't even imagine it would have that effect, that it might help other people feel like bisexuality is worthy of talking about. That was really the goal. So I hope there's a lot more to come from it.
And that was one of the themes that was just so ever present in the book, is that questioning whether or not your experience, your identity, like whether or not it deserves. And this idea of like taking up space, which I think is something we all wrestle with, regardless of from what vantage point we're coming from. Either we're socialized to not take up space. And so then you're like, am I worthy enough to take up enough space? Or we're socialized to take up too much space and we end up stomping all over everybody in the meantime. So what's funny is simultaneous to this, right before I started reading the book, my former partner, current best friend, and I went to the Moth. We run into really posh, really influential Portlanders who has like a social book club that you cannot get into. My former partner, current best friend, a Fox, I call her, was saying that she was writing a memoir. And she was like, well, we have a joke in our club that we don't even pay attention to a memoir that somebody wrote under 40. Because what have they lived through? But thank goodness for you, you're older. And so we might entertain it. It just struck me so much, that comment. In listening to you in your book, having that part of that be a theme that you can tell that you were wrestling with, it disheartened me a little bit in putting the two of those together. That we're living in a culture that in so many ways allows people to feel like their stories and their experiences don't matter and they shouldn't take up the space in a lot of these institutions that are dominated by people who are coming to it from the same place.
That is just such an absurd comment, because one of the best memoirs I read last year is the book Beautiful Country by Chen Julie Wong, who is, feel very honored to say, is now a friend of mine. We met through like a first time author Slack, and like, oh my God, to miss out on that book because you think that someone under 40 hasn't had a life experience. That whole memoir takes place in Chen Julie's undocumented childhood from the ages of like 8 to 12. It's so powerful, and to dismiss those years and someone reflecting on those years as being able to tell that story is absurd. Their loss, truly. I understand, though, the sentiment. When I wanted to write a memoir when I was like 22, I wasn't ready. I hadn't come out as bi. I hadn't done a lot of things, and I really needed more time to sit with that. It's such a personal thing, though. I feel like if I had written it any later, it would have missed the mark. I think I wrote it at the exact right time for myself and for the story. It's interesting, the idea of imposter syndrome, though, because so the first chapter in my book is called A Story to Ease the Author's Imposter Syndrome. I wrote it when I was about halfway through the book, and I was like, you don't even deserve to be writing this, Jen. You're probably straight. I was having those thoughts, even though I'm in a queer relationship and was at the time. I was still like, what's going on? Why are you writing this? You're not an authority. And so I wrote this note to myself, and it ended up being the first chapter of the book. And a lot of people have asked me if that imposter syndrome I talk about is not just about bisexuality, but also about writing. I think in a way the two are linked, because so much of it is about telling your story. I had imposter syndrome that people would think bisexuality was important enough to write a book about. A lot of people I spoke to early on, I said I was writing a book about bisexuality, and they said, everyone's bi. That's awesome. You'll have a huge target audience. As you know, as a marketer, and to your earlier point, like targeting everyone is targeting no one. That's the same thing that bi people kind of wrestle with when we're told that everyone is bi. It's like this weird backwards microaggression. That's how microaggressions work. It's supposed to be a compliment, but it ends up just dismissing you and your validity. I didn't have imposter syndrome about my ability as a writer, but I did have it around whether I was allowed to write this book, whether this book should exist. And I had to just keep pushing through that. And really, that's what the kind messages I get, they mean so much to me because they help remind me that it was important to write this book because people saw themselves in it and they see themselves and now they get to go take that and do whatever they're supposed to do. That's like the greatest reward ever.
It felt very cathartic and healing in a way because there's enough distance to go through this journey with you and be in it and be present for it and allow it to unfold and come to a place where it's like, yes, this feels good. This feels solid, even though we don't have 100% of things figured out. We have a few core pieces. There's I hesitate to say emotional residue because it's like glitter fallout, if that makes sense. Like it's like a beautiful like thing that's left that ends up on a subconscious level helping you work through your own shit because it's not you having to go back through your life and process all of these things. You're getting to do it through this avatar that you resonate with. So I can attest to that. For me, it definitely, there were a lot of things, especially when it came to like a lot of the interactions with men and like trying to figure out the power in it. A lot of that stuff that like going back and looking through my life, even though it's been many years, it's like, oh yeah, there was a lot in there that instead of me looking at baby G, I got to look at baby Jen, which was awesome.
Well, I'm happy to have my baby pictures on display. I think the parts of the book that are best were the parts that when I forgot people were going to read it and I was really just writing for myself to process things. And sometimes I would get to a point like the story to ease the author's imposter syndrome came from a pure moment of me being like, you don't deserve to write this book. And then I was like, wait, I do. And then I was like, unpack this moment that you're like thinking about right now. I did that. And it ended up being really relatable to people. That's one of the chapters people comment on the most. And that was not why I wasn't writing it. So it's like, you'll open the book and feel seen. I was writing it because like, that was the first thought I have when I'm writing a book about bisexuality is like, no one wants you to be talking about this. Like you're not queer enough and you don't have enough experiences. And so something else I've actually thought a lot about is that I don't know that I would have gotten this book deal if I had been dating a man at the time, if I had been dating a woman, or if I'd been single. Like, I think the fact that I was and am dating a trans masc, non-binary person who uses they, them pronouns was like very important for the book being received well by publishers and that story being told. Because one big tactic of bi erasure, and it's not like unfounded, like there's reasons people say this, but is that bisexuality reinforces the binary and the gender binary. That one really hurts me because that's one of the reasons I didn't come out as bi for a long time too, because I thought I don't want to dismiss anybody's identity with my sexuality. Like that seems stupid. I'll just stay not out. Like everything's fine. I'll just not, I'll just keep occasionally trying to go on dates with women and having them fail. I'm used to that. Yeah, I just really was nervous about that. And so I think me being in this relationship and like that being part of my personal arc, my partner and I've talked about it several times. It's weird. It's like weird that like Brinley, my partner, is always like, I am responsible for your book. Like you would have no book without me, which is true, both because they're my first queer relationship and I don't know, probably last, who knows? I mean, yeah, who knows if we'll someday open things up. I mean, they really, I think that visibility for the bi community to have like someone who's like, I'm bi and I'm in a relationship with a non-binary person, but I'm proudly bisexual is just not something that we have. And it kind of answers the question of, isn't bisexuality dismissing non-binary people? Like it answers that question of like, no, and it makes you want to learn more. So there's that weird side of things that's like this personal aspect.
That's so fascinating.
Because we need to get to a space where a bi person is not defined by what relationship they're in. Like that's the whole point. That's the whole reason that I wrote this, like that ability to sit between spaces can exist. Like it does not need another person to make that a reality. Like you don't have to date a non-binary person to be bisexual and to be a valid bisexual. I really do think that we like weren't ready for that conversation. Like we weren't ready to really allow that conversation because there's still so much biphobia in the world. So
it dovetails a lot with queer relationships that aren't based on your gender identity, right? Because your gender identity is something that you can own, but your sexual identity is something that is perceived as bumping up against another human or human in order to manifest. And so I guess asexuality being the outlier there, right? So if I'm identify as a lesbian, I can continue to identify that way if I am in a relationship with someone, or I'm not, but my past relationships have been with people that fit that criteria. That's the part to me that's always felt so precarious, is that there's a prescriptive nature to who you are allowing yourself to potentially fall in love with when it threatens your identity and your social standing within a community, which is the part about bisexuality, and particularly the way that because I haven't done a lot of research as of late, that I'm attributing to you as having reframed for me, is that it's a broader space that allows more room. Because personally, this has been something that I've been struggling with for a while, that it's like, what if I were to have a relationship with one of my friends from the past who now identifies as a trans man? Could I still identify as lesbian or gay? Maybe, but could I that might also not be affirming to the person that I'm with, right? It's interesting when we think about bisexuality, because how do you, and you shouldn't have to, right? But like, how do you show it in a way that people can't dismiss it? Because to your point, like if you were in what looked like a cis hetero relationship, but you were doing a book on bisexuality, there would probably be a whole bunch of reviews streaming in talking about how you don't belong and how what you're saying isn't valid and all of these things, even though they wouldn't be accurate because of how biphobia manifests.
Totally. Also, there are already a lot of reviews that are like, there's so much about men in this book. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry. Like, I wish there wasn't. I wish the same as you. I wish I had different experiences. But oh my God, that's really interesting. I actually, and this is me, I guess, not being a monosexual person, which monosexual refers to like you are either attracted to all the same gender or all a different gender. It means like one, you are all attracted in one direction, as opposed to bisexual. Like often bisexuality is seen as the opposite of monosexuality. What you're describing, you're sort of not a monosexual lesbian. You're like a sexually fluid lesbian, which like that should be able to exist because like language should mean whatever it can mean to us. I totally hear what you're saying, that like that could be really invalidating to someone who identifies as or like say you're dating someone who's presenting as a woman and then they come out to you and say they're a trans man. How does your identity change in relation to that? And I think a lot of people go through that when partners transition, which is like quite common. It reminds me of this joke. Now it's become a joke that my partner and I kind of had in the beginning of our relationship. So we were talking about whether a trans man dating a woman would be straight. I was coming from a cis perspective, but I'd seen like trans men are men. Like I knew those things, I knew like the basics. I was like, a trans man dating a woman is straight, like, or like, unless they're like bi, or something else, they're straight. And Brinley, my partner, kept saying, they're not straight. They're not straight. And I was like, you're invalidating them. You're invalidating them by saying that. We like never really dug into it, but we like each had these opposing opinions for like several weeks. And then one day, Brinley just got very emotional and was like, I just don't think it's fair that you would ever ask anyone to be straight or ever assume that anyone is straight. Like, it's just not fair. And I was like, oh my God, you have been queer for so long that like, it was so interesting to see our different vantage points. But I mean, of course, a trans person can be, like you mentioned earlier, there are different axes of like your sexuality versus, I mean, you can be queer and be in a heterosexual presenting relationship. You can do whatever you want. When it gets tricky is when our identities are kind of built around exclusion. This doesn't happen for bisexuality because it's kind of all encompassing. It's like,
Yeah.
whatever, I'll take whatever. But I see how it happens for identities like lesbian. It feels like if you are going to be in a relationship with someone, then it genders that other person, similar to like what my mom said. Like my mom gendered my partner based on thinking I was a lesbian through her weird logic. But
Mhm.
that's really interesting. And I hadn't thought about that as a component of monosexual identities or terms, I guess I should say, because the identities can be expansive, but the terms are often exclusionary. And it's just really interesting because you do have to think about how those things impact others.
I have a couple friend of mine that they're both trans and they identify as trans, like one is full F to M and one is M to F, and not in a non-binary sense, right? So one of the things that they've mentioned is that they're queer people in a hetero relationship. And it's just interesting to me because, you know, like in that experience, which of course I can't speak to you from my personal experience, but for them, it sounds like feeling like that full transition, saying that they're in a hetero relationship validates each of their full transition as living in the gender that they knew themselves always to be, but that there's something inherently queer about who they are because they're both trans. And I feel like it's fascinating. And we did a podcast episode with Hina, if you've seen them on TikTok, they're the lesbian parent. They do a whole series on the lesbian parent, and they're just like
amazing,
super fucking cool, amazing. And they identify as non-binary lesbian. And so I'm really excited to see how things will grow and shift and change in terms of all of this kind of sticky weirdness and how we identify ourselves and how we code the relationships that we're in. And to me, and I'm curious for you, it seems like the trend is more toward these non-binary spaces. So toward bisexuality, toward non-binary gender identities, and that the more time goes by, the more nuance we have, the more people will really subscribe to or feel like they belong in more of an in-between space instead of the binaries that we've been taught to believe in.
That is where I hope the future goes. I mean, I think that like is in part with a bunch of other things. One, I had a lot of like realizations while writing my book, as I guess like you do as you write. Joan Didion, may she rest in peace, always said, "I write to figure out what I think," or she wrote that once. And I always say it to myself. And like, while I thought of these lesbian and gay spaces and physical spaces as so firm in their boundaries, like you are only allowed in like if you identify this way, those are also primarily white spaces. And I kind of was realizing this thing that is not new to the world by any means, but felt present for me, is that like there are plenty of queer physical spaces that invite fluidity, that like welcome it. And the thing that I hadn't picked up on is that those spaces are like, they also decenter whiteness, because that's something that you also have to do in order to really fully like embrace that shattering of these norms. I hope that that is also something that comes with, shifting toward these binaries and these fluid states. And I think, to circle back to the thing you said at the beginning about seeing elements of the in-between state and referencing it back to being mixed across a variety of identities, like I hope that those identity shifts happen as well. Like I'm not able to speak as well to them, but like we kind of started there. I didn't touch on it that much, but I think to bring it back to that is important in terms of where we're headed.
Yay, I love that. Okay, are you ready for the G-Speed round?
Yes.
Only rule is you cannot overthink it. Name one thing you were teased about as a kid.
My lisp.
See, I love it. Do you love it now? Is it something that like you've claimed?
I don't notice it. When I notice it, I hate it still, but I now know that it goes away if I drink a lot of water, hence.
No, I listened to the Audible version of your book. I have a hard time reading and processing, so I listened to everything at like 3x speed. And yeah, I didn't clock it. It wasn't until I did video and I was watching your mouth move that I was like, oh, but to me, like it's one of those things that, when you just see like these little specific features of people that to me make
Yeah.
them really endearing.
My partner always says that it makes me a terrible like lip syncer. Like every time I try to lip sync, you can like see my tongue in like a weird place it shouldn't be. There's like one joke I rewrote for the Audible version that like acknowledges the lisp early on because I was like, this has to happen. So
Yes.
I tried to be self-aware.
Yes. Okay. What is your most cringy memory?
I've been playing out this memory recently where I was friends with this guy. We were like coworker friends and he was dating this girl he really liked. I thought she was awesome, but she kind of broke his heart. And he and I weren't that good of friends. But then I started like working with her on a project like a few years later. He asked me to get a drink and then was like, hey, that really hurt me. And I've been playing that memory out about how like shitty it was of me to do that. And to just like be friends with this person who ghosted him and like didn't speak to him. And I knew he was like broken up about it. And also how great of him it was to tell me about it. So I don't know why I've been sitting with that one this week.
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, I feel like most of mine are relationship based too, and like lack of communication. Okay, if you could wave a magic wand and instill one truth in all of humanity, what would it be?
Probably that binaries are fake and just be consistent with my message. Let's go with that.
Okay, non-binary lifestyle.
Yes.
Okay, who was your early tween heartthrob or celebrity crush?
Josh Hartnett. It's like embarrassing.
I remember though, there were a few movies in there that
I was also in the one 40 Days and 40 Nights. I was also really into that woman who like he slept with, but without sleeping with, who he like ran I forget her name. I feel like she stopped being in
can't
stuff,
remember.
but she was amazing. Yeah, she was amazing.
Okay, what is the thing you're most proud of?
My book.
Okay, if we were to catch you engaging in your most dorktacular, silly activity, what would we find you doing?
You would find me playing this horrific solitaire game on my phone that I like cannot seem to quit. Although I've sort of replaced it with Wordle as of late.
I've never heard of that one.
Oh, I feel like you'll hear about it like immediately after we're done. Like it's like once you hear it, you'll see it everywhere. It's just this game where you try to guess the word. It's like Boggle meets Mastermind, kind of.
Ooh.
But it's big on Twitter right now. But probably playing online games and like spending money on them, like embarrassingly. That's like my worst pandemic habit, and it needs to go. It needs to stop.
Well, hashtag no judgment, but that actually sounds kind of fun.
It's not. Don't do it. Save yourself.
Okay, finish the sentence. I feel most powerful when?
I feel most powerful when I live a day that aligns with my values. And right now, my values are self-care, family, and creativity. So when I've done investments in all of those things, when I've like written something and like gotten a good night's sleep and spent time with my partner and my dogs, that's the trifecta.
Okay. What is in all of your podcast interviews, all the questions that have been flung at you, what's one that nobody seems to ask that would be a really good one?
I guess people don't ask about my dogs enough. I can't talk about them enough. I guess the question would be, how much do you love your dogs? And I'd be like, so much. Do you want to see pictures and share all the pictures? But my dogs are named Astro and Navy, and I love them so much.
I love that. Well, if you feel like it, we would love to put pictures in the show notes because I feel like there are a lot of people who would be into that.
I have way too many. I'll send them to you.
Okay. Lastly, what does it mean to be living into the boldest, truest version of yourself?
I think it means asking questions that you didn't know you had to ask. So looking for new questions to ask yourself and having that be an ever growing pursuit.
Yes. Jen, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for your amazing book, for you just being the incredible human that you are, and for really like putting energy and work out there into the world that helps people feel validated and seen and, inspired to live into their truth. You're a badass, and I appreciate you.
Aw, thank you. So are you. I loved this conversation. And I also just want to commend you. At one point, you used the word obtuse. And I was like, yes, you have a great vocabulary. And I loved this conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay, so tell people where they can connect with you and where they can buy your book and all of that good stuff.
Yes. So you can follow me on, I almost said Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at generous with a J. And then you can buy my book, Greedy Notes from a Bisexual Who Wants Too Much, wherever books are sold.
And Audible. The Audible is great because you actually read it. Resonance level at 22 out of 10.
Oh, thank you.
Jen Winston, everybody. Boop, boop. Like, hello, amazing. I just fucking love them. And I'm so grateful for this conversation, right? Because there were so many light bulb moments for me where it was just like, wow, like these are parts of me that I maybe haven't examined, or these are experiences that are similar, maybe slightly different, maybe more similar than I thought. And also, the fact that they were just so beautifully transparent about their process. And for all of us, whether we're wanting to create a book or do any other thing in life, there's so much beauty in hearing really what it is behind the scenes, really understanding what that process could look like. Not that ours is going to match it, but really understanding. I mean, because, we always see like the glittery photos crossing the marathon finish line with the banners and confettis and the shock blankets. But really, when you think about it, understanding what somebody's experience was like through mile 1, mile 5, mile 13.2, like all of that, I think is so beneficial and so helpful understanding what the training was. I mean, you see where I'm going with this analogy, that it helps us get grounded in what our dreams could look like and actually how to take those steps to get there. So I am just so in love with this conversation. I love you. Thank you for hanging out with us. And as always, if you want to help the podcast grow, it will mean the most to me just by sharing it with a friend, tagging yourself listening to it on Instagram. All of that stuff is so beautiful. And also, if you send me a message, I love them, I receive them, and I'm definitely so grateful for every single person who has done that because it means the most. I hope you have a fantabulous week. I hope you show up in your boldness, in your sparkletality, in your owning the amazingness that is you. I love you. I think you are an incredible human, and I'm so grateful that you are showing up in the world, learning, living, glowing to the max, and I will see you next week. Bye.